The Lord passed before him and proclaimed, the Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for the 1,000th generation, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, yet by no means clearing the guilty, but visiting the iniquity of the parents upon the children and the children's children, to the 3rd and the 4th generation. And Moses quickly bowed down to the ground and worshipped. He said, If now I have found favor in your sight, my Lord, I pray, let my Lord go with us. Although this is a stiff-necked people, pardon our iniquity and our sin, and take us for your inheritance.
Hi, I'm Jacob.
Hi, I'm Nina.
Hi, I'm Mike.
And this is the Fig Tree Podcast. Okay, so we are on our 6th episode of the podcast, and this week we are talking about the second half of the book of Exodus. I do want to just acknowledge real quick, yes, we did miss a week. It was because, as Mother Nina said, you want to...
Yeah, God definitely flipped both of our check engine lights, and we had no choice but to obey. Pull over to the side of the road.
Yeah, so in light of that, how's everyone doing?
I'm doing great.
Yeah?
Yes. I just had a really nice 4-day weekend. And, yeah.
That sounds quite lovely.
And I was at Curcio and following the little paths of Christ.
Could you tell us a little bit about Curcio?
So Curcio is a movement started by the Catholics in the 1800s. And now for the last 80 years, there's been an Episcopal Curcio that follows the same thing. And it's the little path of Christ. And it's, just getting to know Christ better and to have a better Christian walk through study, piety, and action.
That sounds great.
And I wanted to go too, but I was at home dealing with my check engine light.
Yeah.
So luckily it's turned off again, and here we are again. Glad to be here with you two and all our listeners.
Yeah, I too had my check engine light on. That might have something to do with being at the Epiphany Youth Retreat with dozens of middle school boys.
Sounds like a Petri dish to me.
Yeah, so... but we're back. So this week we're talking about the second half of the book of Exodus. We had to split this into 2 parts because we were just so excited for all of the content that we want to talk about. So last time we talked about Israel's escape from Egypt, but this week we're talking about the rest of the book of Exodus. There's a little more, isn't there?
So once Israel is set free, they begin to travel.
But things almost immediately start to go wrong, huh?
Well, it's not that things were easy before, but they're definitely not easy, just in a different way. And so the Israelites begin to complain. They say, if only we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, when we sat by the flesh pots and ate our fill of bread. For you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Do you remember what God does in response?
Sends Panera bread from heaven. Manna.
So I've heard that the closest thing that we have to manna on this earth is frosted cornflakes.
Ooh, I love Frosted Flakes. I would be totally down. I eat Frosted Flakes so much. I probably shouldn't, but I love them.
Oh,
they're
my
so
goodness,
good.
Jacob.
And I think that I could eat Frosted Flakes off the ground.
I think so. Yeah, I agree.
Okay, you guys. So God sends bread and quails from heaven. Does that sound familiar to you from the New Testament? There's this parallel, of course, with the loaves and the fishes where Jesus feeds the 5,000 and the 4,000. So the Israelites have enough food. But then they begin to complain about not having enough water. So God instructs Moses to strike a rock with his staff, and water pours out.
I've always thought, we hear these stories and we just think like Israel is so silly. And we think that we would act differently in the same situation. But then I also think about the fact that we complain when our air conditioning goes out or when we have to be on our feet for too long in a day. I was struck thinking about, I saw the video of those, of all the people coming back from into Gaza by foot. And it's just like, dang, I mean, I can't even imagine walking that long, not because you want to, but because you have to. And so, I don't think we would fare much better than the Israelites.
I know. Well, we have desert out here in California, and I know that I wouldn't be out walking around between the months of May and late September. It'd be way too hot.
There's not enough water. I spent a lot of time in Baja and as a kid and looking for rocks with my dad out in the middle of nowhere for hours and days on ends, and the waters and rattlesnakes and Gila monsters.
And as far as I know, like Israel, in terms of like topography and climate, is actually very similar to here. I remember in seminary, one of my professors would say that we have biblical geography. And so it would be like walking around the California deserts for just days and months and years on end.
Well, that's pretty cool. Well, there's a lesson here for us that even when we don't see it or think about it, God is helping us and working on our behalf.
I think a lot of times we do take God for granted, like the things that God is doing for us, because our lives are not perfect or maybe the way that we want them to be. We can take these gifts that God has given us for granted and not acknowledge the ways in which God is helping us.
I remember many times when I was younger where I thought God had forgotten me and I wasn't important enough. And as I look back through my life, once my eyes are open, I realized that God was always there. He never left me.
Exactly. I felt the same way, Mike. Yeah, that God was there, but just wasn't seeing me for whatever reason. But in actuality, we're never alone.
Yeah, it's tremendously comforting in a way to read, about these people who have felt in many ways the same way, maybe even worse than we have, because it reminds us that God is with us even when we can't see it.
So eventually the people of Israel reach Mount Sinai, and God has Moses say to the people, "Now therefore, if you obey my voice and keep my covenant, you shall be my treasured possession out of all the peoples. Indeed, the whole earth is mine, but you shall be for me a priestly kingdom and a holy nation." And the people all respond, "Everything that the Lord has spoken, we will do."
So what is this about them being a kingdom of priests?
So remember God's covenant with Abraham and Sarah? There was 3 parts to it. And one of the parts was that the whole world would be blessed through him. Israel is meant to represent God and bring about God's salvation for the whole world. So then God comes down in a cloud to Mount Sinai, and Moses goes up the mountain to meet with God. And while he's there, God tells him his expectations of Israel and the 10 Commandments. Do you remember the 10 Commandments?
Yep.
Well, when I was a kid, I called them the 10 Amendments. I was a little confused.
The 10 Amendments. It's funny. I actually grew up with a different ordering of the 10 Commandments than people who grew up in Protestant churches, because I grew up Catholic. And I don't know if you knew this, but the Catholic ordering is different than the Protestant one. So what really happens is in the first 2 commandments, in the Protestant church, the first 2 are, "You shall not have any gods but me." And then the second one is, "You shall not make for yourself any graven images." So they separate having other gods and making idols. But in the Catholic Church, they combine those 2. So, "I am the Lord your God, you shall not have any gods before me" is the first one. And then the second one is, "You shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain," which is the third in the Protestant ordering. And then they split the coveting commandment. So in the Protestant ordering, it's just one commandment: "You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor." That's the last one. But in the Catholic Church, it's one commandment about not coveting your neighbor's wife, and then another one about not coveting your neighbor's goods.
So in the Protestant ordering, there's 4 about loving God and 6 about loving others. But in the Catholic ordering, there's 3 about loving God and 7 about loving others. Is that right?
Interesting. I haven't even thought about that. Yeah, that sounds right to me.
Mike, how many commandments do you have?
So, thank God for the Sermon on the Mount, and Jesus' words are where they asked him about the commandments. He says that there's 2. Love the Lord thy God with all thy heart, mind, and soul, and love thy neighbor as thyself. And if I do those 2 correctly, I've done all the other 10 as well, right? As long as I follow God and put him first and put you first, then I can't really covet anything or be jealous of anything or have idols or any of those things.
It's often referred to as the summary of the law because it encapsulates the entirety of the law, like the motivation behind all of the different commandments.
It's a lot easier to remember, too. I like how you memorized it.
Yeah. So Jesus preaches the Sermon on the Mount, and he's depicted as the new Moses, giving the new law. That's actually like a big theme in what Matthew's doing in his gospel. And so Jesus talks about all of those 10 commandments and their spiritual meaning in his sermon. But he says, just like Mike said, that all of the commands of the law are summarized in those 2 things, loving God and loving neighbor. But then I was kind of thinking about this, and if you have ever turned in the Book of Common Prayer to our catechism, which we've referenced a couple times on the podcast, there's a really great section. I think it's on page 847. So that's page 847 of the Book of Common Prayer. But the Catechism has this really awesome section on the 10 Commandments that explain their meaning, and it begins just like Mike kind of said. It says, "What do we learn from these commandments?" We learn 2 things: our duty to God and our duty to our neighbors.
And I learned a really great lesson by putting those 2 things first, is that if I do those, I can't be selfish. I can't live in self-pity. I can't self-loathe. And so most things about self, if I put God and you first, it's almost impossible to be selfish.
Yeah. So why don't we walk through the 10 Commandments? I think it's a worthwhile exercise. So we have in front of us the kind of BCP Catechism explanations. So please feel free, all who are listening, and us ourselves, I guess, to go back into the Catechism and meditate on these explanations. I think it's a worthwhile thing to do. But first, our first commandment. Mike, you want to tell us our first commandment?
You shall not have any gods but me. Or to love and obey God and to bring others to know him.
Right, that's the BCP's explanation of it.
Yes.
You know those big foam fingers that you get at sporting events with, the number 1 finger holding up? That's what I think of when I see this one. God is number 1.
Do you think this has sometimes we think about this command as just being about not worshiping other gods, and that makes it very easy for somebody who considers themselves a Christian, I think, because I don't know about you, but I'm not usually tempted to go down the street to the Vedic temple and sacrifice to a Hindu god or something. But I don't know. What do you think?
How deep do we want to go here? Right.
We can go deep.
I could worship money.
Ooh, yeah.
I can worship people.
Yep.
I can worship establishments, right? Even sometimes church.
Yeah.
I could worship my shoe collection.
Right.
Yeah. This we'll talk more about this part later. And I think this is actually part of why the Catholic ordering kind of conflates the first 2 commandments, because they're very similar. But you've got the idolatry episode, and we'll talk about that. But I remember a quote from John Calvin, which I don't know if I fully agree with, but is an interesting one, is that the human heart is an idol factory. And so we're just constantly finding other things to worship besides God.
Right. And I like to say that I have this big, giant God hole, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm constantly trying to find something to fill it, even though it could be easily filled if I just turn my eyes or my ears to the right, to God, right? But I've stuffed a lot of things in there, cars and bowling balls and skis and boats. I've stuffed a lot of things in that hole, and nothing worked except God.
Right.
Sounds kind of uncomfortable.
So I guess that brings us to our second commandment. You shall not make for yourself any graven images.
To put nothing in the place of God.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think you described it really well, Mike.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. God-shaped holes in all of us.
Yeah.
Only one thing fits, and that's God.
Mm-hmm.
And I still have this crazy brain that forgets.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Oh, it'll work this time.
I think it's interesting too, because this one, it is in the duty to God category. But on the other hand, there's this a part that's our duty to our neighbor, in that, as we talked about on the podcast before, there is already an image of God on earth, and we don't have to make it, because it's us.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, so then there's the third commandment, which is, you shall not take the name of the Lord your God in vain. What is that one about?
Well, I always think it's like the story of the boy who cried wolf, right? So I taught kids, if you say God's name, God says yes, and be ready to pray to God, right? Because if you then just ignore God, what happens when you really do need God? Now that story says you might be out of luck, the story about the boy who cried wolf, and of course that would never happen. But still, I think it's a good illustration. When you call God's name, mean it.
And my great-grandma would tell me that whenever I used God's name in vain, it was letting the devil talk through me.
Whoa.
There's this commandment usually gets attached to what we call taking the Lord's name in vain, right? Which is just using, like, saying God, whatever, or Jesus or something as a cuss word, or as in an inappropriate way. And I think, we don't want to downplay that, because as we've already discussed, I think it's not good. But do you think there's more going on in this commandment than just, saying God in the wrong time?
Absolutely. So it's also like how I carry myself and how I talk. So I was raised on a boat. I was around fishermen and pirates, and every other word was a cuss word. And
did you say pirates?
yeah, pirates. we call them pirates. And so we cursed a lot, but we cursed because we were driven by fear, and we thought it made us look tough, right? And so I had this experience 14 years ago where I worked these steps and got closer to God and got right with my past. So I had no fear of my future. And it was like all those things were cast out. One day, I was driving down the freeway, and two people tried to cut me off, and I just let them in. I didn't flip them off. I didn't cuss. I didn't scream. I went and I was around a bunch of people that I knew from fishing, and I didn't say one bad word.
That's good.
And everybody's looking at me and like, what's going on? But I realized that it was because I lived in fear, and because it was pride and ego and all these things that it made me feel tough and hard and cool, right? But that's not what God wants. God wants me, just me, not all this cool stuff.
Yeah.
And I didn't need it. And it was like cast out.
One of the things that I think of with the God's name in vain passage is I think of the people that have those signs that say God hates, insert whatever, right? And they're taking the name of God, right? And they're taking the authority of God to say that God hates or does something, right? And it's patently untrue, right? We don't believe that. And so in doing so, they take God's name in vain. Whether they meant to cuss with God's name or not, they're taking God's name in vain by attributing to God that which is not true. And I think maybe that should give us pause too, because even though that's an extreme example, do we do that? Do we take God's authority to say things that are actually just our opinions?
What about the fourth commandment?
Mm-hmm.
You shall not take the name. Well, I already did that one. You shall remember the Sabbath and keep it holy.
Yes, the Sabbath commandment. What's going on there?
Well, it's about setting aside regular time for worship and prayer and the study of God's ways. And for the Jewish people, of course, it's Friday night to Saturday night. And for the Christian people, it's Sunday. But for those of us who work on Sunday, we usually take it on another day, like Saturday. It's really interesting.
So it should spend the whole day, one day, just being with God. And not have all these other pressures and things going on everywhere else. Just me and him.
Yeah.
Like he wanted to be in the Garden of Eden with Adam and Eve. Just them.
Exactly. And not doing any work. When I went to Israel, it was in 2022, the very first night we stayed at a hotel in Tel Aviv, and it was not the Sabbath, but there was a sign on the elevator saying that on the Sabbath, the elevator just kind of works on its own. So nobody even has to press a button. It just keeps going up and down, stopping at every single floor.
Wow.
So you just jump on and you get off when it's your floor, but you don't have to specify anything.
They really take the Sabbath extremely seriously. That's pretty crazy.
It's kind of refreshing.
Yeah.
When I was in the Holy Land, it was crazy because we were there during Ramadan. So everything would shut down for Ramadan in the Muslim side of things. But then on Saturday, you couldn't do any of the things with the Jewish guide or Jewish people because they didn't do anything. And then on Sunday, all the Armenians and the Christians and the Catholics and the Orthodox people wouldn't do anything on the Sundays. So it was cool. There was always somebody that was doing something on those days, but not those people.
Yeah. It's this is a commandment, I think, that is so important for us, I think, to pay attention to, because in our culture, we live in a capitalist society, and please don't take this as a comment on capitalism. I don't know. That's not the point. But the reality is that we prioritize work above almost anything else in our culture. And while that makes us incredibly productive, it has side effects. It has costs. And I think there's almost nothing more countercultural than that we could do than just rest for a day. Think about it. We, for example, bring our inboxes home because of our cell phones. So we never get a break, ever. Even when we're away from work, we're not away from work because it comes with us in our phones. And I just think there's really something to this. And you can see even the world is kind of encroaching on Sunday too, right? Like businesses are open on Sunday, everything's open on Sunday.
There's lots of sporting events. Kids are
events.
practicing and having games on Sunday mornings.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's changed. It's just because there's just not enough fields to go around, so they have to have them open on Sunday morning.
Right.
But now the churches compete for that time slot. It's really rough.
Right.
But if I'm to love the Lord my God with all my heart, mind, and soul, what better way than just to spend the whole day with him?
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, and to set aside a day of our week that is dedicated only to God. and to show that God is a priority. It's hard enough just to set aside a few minutes in our days sometimes for people.
And your heart, body, mind, and soul will sing. And your check engine light will not come on. Hopefully.
Yeah. It's actually, I like that you said that, because it also kind of hits that idolatry thing. We have this almost idolatry that we can just do it all, that we have no limits. We act like that, but that's not true.
It's the message of the world, and Jesus is constantly telling us to look to him and not the world.
Yeah. So we've covered our duty to God in those first commandments, but then there's our duty to our neighbor. That's how the BCB Catechism in any case.
So the first one is honoring your father and mother, which means to love, honor, and help our parents and family, to honor those in authority, and to meet their just demands.
Yeah. I think this one's pretty straightforward, right?
Yeah, and it can be complicated depending on your family relationships, but I think it's important just to understand it at its essence.
For sure, yeah.
Yeah.
And every 20 years, that description of that kind of changes anyway. Right? It's still different than it was when we were kids.
Exactly.
That's true, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, this can get misused for sure, but I think there's a good principle here.
Yeah, maybe another way of looking at it is honoring your elders, honoring those who helped raise you.
Which we don't always do. I just think about, I used to do retirement community chaplaincy, and there is something to be said for the fact that, again, because of our obsession with success and career and all of that, we kind of do just shove our elders into homes and forget about them. But all right, so then there's the sixth commandment: you shall not murder.
That can lead into a really interesting conversation between the differences between murder and killing.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I don't know about you. I haven't killed anyone, intentionally or otherwise.
Yeah.
So am I just good to go on this command? Mike's shaking his head. No?
You're not good to go.
Oh.
Tell us more, Mike.
So I can kill relationships. I can kill people's hopes and dreams. I can do a lot of murdering of things that's just not the same as what Cain did to Abel.
Interesting.
Yeah, I like that you connected it to Cain and Abel.
Well, and a lot of religious people, a lot of churches would put this number one, right?
They would.
It's the biggest, baddest thing that you can do is murder. And with a lot of churches and religions, it's unforgivable. And you don't get any redemption. But I'm not in total agreement with that.
Yeah.
Well, I wonder, too, by your definition of murder, if there are some churches out there that are doing some murdering. Yeah.
The BCP Catechism talks about it, meaning that we need to show respect for the life that God has given us, to work and pray for peace, to bear no malice, prejudice, or hatred in our hearts, and to be kind to all the creatures of God. Well, suddenly I think that becomes a problem for a lot of us.
So that isn't one just to skip over, even though I think most people do.
No, yeah.
But what about this next one? That, gosh, makes people squirm. You shall not commit adultery. I know when I taught the 10 Commandments to the kids, I kind of renamed this Keep Your Promises, because I didn't want to have to explain adultery to a second grader. But it's actually deeper than that, isn't it?
Yeah.
If you look at the definition that's in the BCP.
To use all our bodily desires as God intended.
So it's not just adultery against your spouse, but it's adultery against God and how we use our bodies.
Yeah. Yeah, we don't have to belabor this, but God has designed our bodies to be used in a specific way, and and of course this, by the way, gets misused. I should probably mention that because maybe somebody listening has had this weaponized against them, but it is true that God designed those things we use our bodies for a specific purpose, to be in a specific context of a relationship with another person, a loving relationship. You shall not steal.
That's a tough one.
Mm-hmm.
So it says to be honest and fair in our dealings, to seek justice, freedom, and the necessities of life for all people, and to use our talents and possessions as ones who must answer for them to God.
Well, that kind of changes everything, doesn't it? It's a whole different outlook. So if I could do anything, especially in this country and other countries, to help people get along politically, religiously, and everything, I would just have them do this, right? Because then you're trusting God to do these things. You know, and if someone was to ask me what's the answer to all these things, I would say, well, let's try to do this.
Yeah.
The eighth commandment, the new world order.
Yeah.
There you go.
All right, Mike.
There's
you
like
figured it out.
a great quote from Saint Basil where he talks about the whole book is worth reading. It's on social justice by Saint Basil, but he talks about how by failing to give to the poor when you have more than enough, it's not just that you are like not doing your duty or something like that. He says you've actually robbed the poor. You have stolen from the mouths of the poor because they were owed the bread that you have hoarded for yourself.
I think it was Basil that said that unused coat in your closet belongs to somebody else.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
So a form of stealing.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And then you shall not bear false witness. What's going on there?
Don't lie.
Right?
Right? So I like the BCP explanation as well, to speak the truth and not mislead others by our silence. So dishonesty is sometimes different than not being honest. Right? So I can be dishonest by not being honest, but I can also be dishonest by the way that I live. I can be fake or not real. I could wear this mask around people. I could be a different person around these people and then that people. And I'm being dishonest. I'm being fake.
Yeah.
Right? And being fake can be dishonest as well. So it can get really deep.
Yeah.
Or witnessing an injustice and just walking on
Right.
by
Yeah.
and not saying anything.
Keeping my mouth shut. Right?
It's funny because I feel like we almost have this mentality sometimes that we can trick God. Like we can like have to the commands that God has given us, but also, kind of get away with being dishonest by not directly lying, but also not quite telling the truth either. Yeah. But I guess that leads us to our last command. You shall not covet anything that belongs to your neighbor.
Don't even look at other people's stuff.
Ooh.
To resist temptations to envy, greed, and jealousy. To rejoice in other people's gifts and graces. And to do our duty for the love of God, who has called us into fellowship with him.
Yeah, I think this is obviously more than just stuff, right? Like, it's about every way in which we might be jealous or envious of somebody. And it's kind of funny because when we think about that, like, other people are also jealous and envious of us. And we can't see that. We can only see the things that we're envious of.
Well, and sometimes they're jealous for exactly the same thing that I'm jealous of them for.
Yeah, yeah.
Isn't it?
Well, often we can't see the burdens that they carry and the gifts that they have, maybe helping to offset those burdens that they carry. We can't see them,
That's right, yeah.
but they're there.
Well, we've read all the commandments now, and They're really hard. I don't think we have any hope of fully obeying them.
Right.
Which, go ahead. Yeah,
well,
go ahead.
In Godly Play, Jerome Berryman calls them the 10 best ways to live, right? That they're like the stepping stones of life. And sometimes, certainly, we fall off, right?
That's
But
right.
the point is to turn and get back on and to keep going, right?
Yeah.
But Jesus does give us a commandment that we can keep
And
every
what's that?
week. Well, it's keeping the Eucharist, coming to the table for Holy Communion.
Right, we come and receive grace each week.
Exactly. We ask for forgiveness for our sins, and we come back to the table over and over and over. And there's nothing stopping us from that. So
There's no limit.
there's no limit.
There's no limit.
I can keep asking for the rest of my life.
You can.
So I can
Unlimited
keep
grace.
falling down, and he's going to keep loving me, good or bad.
Yeah, you betcha.
At the end of that BCP section on the Ten Commandments, it talks about, since we do not fully obey them, are the Ten Commandments useful at all? And it says, since we do not fully obey them, we see more clearly our sin and our need for redemption. And so that command that Jesus gives us for the Eucharist fulfills our need that's created by our inability to fully do all of those things that we're supposed to do. And so we come and receive grace and redemption and forgiveness.
Isn't that a relief? Just makes me happy.
Yeah.
So after the 10 Commandments, God gives a lot more instructions about how to live and how to worship. In fact, there are, some say, 613 commandments in the Torah. And I've heard that there is a tradition that says that is the same number of seeds in a pomegranate.
Oh, interesting.
And I once knew a 6th grade girl who actually went home and took a pomegranate apart and counted every single seed. I think there was something like in the high 200s. It didn't get anywhere near 613. It must have just been a small pomegranate. But in fact, most of the rest of Exodus is really these detailed instructions about how to build the tabernacle and about how to worship God.
Yeah. This section can be the point when we're reading Exodus and we start kind of wondering whether we want to continue reading Exodus because the commands are kind of boring. But if you're reading them, one of the things to pay attention to, one of the things that's notable about all of these instructions about worship is that there's all this garden imagery. There's actually pomegranates, I think, at one point. And there is this idea that God's presence comes to be with Israel, and it's like things are the way that they were always supposed to be.
But since things in the world are not how they are supposed to be, the laws are about making sure the people are ready to be in God's presence.
So God gives the people all this instruction and then makes his covenant with them. But then again, things go awry.
Moses goes up the mountain again, but when he comes down, he finds that the people are worshiping an image of a golden calf, which Aaron made, and said that that was the God that delivered them from Egypt. Uh-oh. This makes Moses really angry. God just told them not to make images or worship other gods. So he breaks the tablets of the 10 Commandments, symbolizing the way that Israel broke the covenant.
I think... Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say, talk about idolatry.
Yeah. There's there's all that stuff that we talked about idolatry earlier, and I think that just fits right in, right? This happens, right? You go to church or have some big spiritual experience, and then right after, then we do something, that we're not supposed to do or something like that. Maybe on the drive home from church, we're flipping off drivers or whatever, I think that's pretty common.
But God doesn't abandon Israel, of course. God instead decides that the people who did this won't make it to the promised land and that their ancestors will instead. That's why it took so many years, right? In the same way, God doesn't abandon us either.
No, but it does underscore the importance of listening to God and following God's way for our lives. when we work with God and when we allow God to direct our lives, then we can lead lives that fulfill that purpose that he has in mind for us.
So there's a lot of times where I'll say, thy will, not mine, be done.
Mm-hmm.
And if I can align my will with God's will and put what God wants for me first, then it's the same thing, right? So I'm doing God's will, and I'm putting God first, loving the Lord my God with all my heart, mind, and soul.
And there's like some hope there, I think, because, just like the Israel golden calf scenario, like we look at the history of the church and it doesn't always look that great. Like we don't always do a very good job at following God. But there's this constant invitation to come back and to just start again, to do it again, and to come back into God's presence and love and goodness and way.
Well, and I think that's a good news, right? Because I see in the Old Testament of all these things, but of what Israel does, but it reminds me of me. And God just keeps taking me back, never gives up.
Yep.
Keeps taking me back.
Yep. So there's one last thing I think would be useful to talk about from Exodus. I know that this episode's going long, but we'll just say we're making up for last week. So there's this one more passage. It's Exodus 34. Moses goes up on the mountain, and it says that when he comes down, his face is shining. Do you think this has anything to teach us?
Does God emit radiation?
Ooh.
Just kidding.
Or you're too close to the sun and you get this
Oh,
big sunburn.
right.
Yeah. You know all about sunburns, don't you, Jacob?
I know so much about sunburns.
Well, it shows that when we're in God's presence, we're changed.
Mm-hmm.
And people can see that on our face.
Yeah, that's right.
Back then, Moses covered his face with a veil so it didn't freak everybody out. But in the New Testament, we hear the Transfiguration, which is coming up this Sunday, actually, where Jesus was transfigured into dazzling light.
Yeah. There's like this foretaste of what's to come that happens on the mountain of the Transfiguration. I think it's really interesting. There was a theory I heard one time. I don't know what to make of this, but I kind of like it. Is there's this idea that in the Transfiguration, time collapsed, and so the Moses, when he's going up on the mountain, that's the same event as the Transfiguration. So the event we read in Exodus is the same as the Transfiguration. Now, I don't know.
That's pretty weird.
It's kind of weird, but it's kind of cool in another way, because Moses appears on the mountain, right? And I don't know, it's just kind of fun.
Elijah's there too.
Oh, that's true. Elijah, yeah. But
Okay. But that's a whole nother podcast.
that's a whole other podcast. That's true. But yeah, so we talked about the garden imagery and the temple worship. And I think that this idea really relates to that, is that when we worship and when we come into God's presence, then things are the way that they were always supposed to be. There's a passage from the Gospel of John where Jesus says, "I am the living bread that came down from heaven, and whoever eats of this bread will live forever. And the bread that I will give for the life of the world is my flesh." And I lock onto that phrase, "for the life of the world."
He's our manna.
That's right. And Jesus is making everything the way that it's supposed to be in that bread, in the Eucharist. There's this great quote from St. Cyril of Alexandria, and he says that the communion in the holy body and the drinking of the saving blood, so Jesus' body and blood, contains the confession of the passion and the death received for us by Christ, as he said himself in instituting for his own the laws of the sacrament. "Whenever you eat this bread and drink of this chalice, you announce the death of the Lord." In the present world, then, by communion with these realities, we announce his death. When we shall be in the glory of the Father, it will be time no longer to confess his passion, but to contemplate him purely as God, face to face. I just thought that was a really relevant quote, that when we meet Jesus, we are meeting him in that foretaste of when we will meet him with unveiled faces, face to face.
Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, Nina.
See you Sunday.
Yeah. Thanks for listening to the Fig Tree Podcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing, leaving a review, or sharing this podcast on social media so others can join us. We hope that you have a great day, and we'll see you next time on the Fig Tree Podcast.